At the end of the last episode, I described depression in men as looking like irritability and withdrawal, working too hard, a glass too many in the evening. And if that description landed somewhere, if something in it felt familiar, well, this episode's for you. Welcome to The Quiet Midlife. In this episode, I want to talk about depression, specifically what depression looks like in men. I mean the real version, the one that tends to get missed, and the one that men themselves frequently don't recognize. The one that is, in measurable terms, actually costing lives. So, by the end of the episode, you should have a clearer picture of how depression presents differently in men, why it goes unrecognized for so long, and what to do, both for yourself or for someone you're concerned about. I think this is an important one, so let's get into it. I wonder if you know that men are significantly less likely than women to be diagnosed with depression, and they're also significantly less likely to seek help for it. They are significantly more likely to reach a crisis point before anyone, including themselves, actually realizes what's been happening. And they die by suicide at a rate of approximately 3 to 4 times of that in women in the UK and nearly 4 times in the US. It's a disparity that's remained stubbornly consistent for decades, and it's not a marginal difference. It's a fundamental, sustained, and largely unaddressed gap between how often men are in serious trouble and how often anyone, including themselves, even knows about it. Now, part of the reason for that gap is the one this episode is about, because depression in men doesn't always look like depression, at least not in the way that most people think about depression. And if you don't know what you're looking for, you don't find it, even when it's right in front of you. Ask most people to describe a depressed person, and they'll describe someone who's basically very sad. I'm talking here about visibly, persistently, and unmistakably sad, tearful, withdrawn, unable to get out of bed, expressing hopelessness in ways that are both legible and recognizable. In some ways, there's nothing wrong with that description, but it's also incomplete, and the gap between this description and how depression actually tends to present in men is, in measurable terms, costing lives. The clinical criteria for depression were developed from research that for much of the 20th century was actually conducted predominantly on female subjects, and that matters because depression, although sharing a core profile across the sexes, does present differently in men, with sufficient consistency that many researchers have proposed a specifically male version of the condition. The result is a diagnostic framework that tends to catch female presentation much more reliably than male. A clinical workforce trained on that framework, and men who are experiencing depression but don't recognize it as depression because it doesn't match the picture that they've been given. The man who's depressed but not sad, who is instead angry, reckless, numb, driven, or drinking, is very unlikely to walk into a surgery and say he thinks he might be depressed. He's also unlikely to think it. What he might do is visit his doctor to complain about some vague back pain, or fatigue, or his sleeplessness. And just as likely, the doctor may attempt to treat the symptoms he's describing rather than dig deeper to establish whether these might be symptoms of depression. So, if we're not talking about sadness, what are we supposed to be looking at? Well, let me take you through the presentations that appear to matter most, the ones that are most likely to be missed, and therefore the ones worth knowing about. The first is irritability and anger. Where women with depression more commonly report sadness, men more commonly report irritability, the short fuse, disproportionate reactions to minor frustrations, a simmering hostility that's got no obvious single cause. So the anger's real enough, but it's frequently a secondary emotion sitting on top of something that the man in question has no language to express directly. So this is the husband who's become unreasonably difficult to live with, the father whose patience has disappeared, the colleague who's become snappy and defensive. These aren't necessarily character changes. They may be depression wearing the only mask that feels permissible. The second is withdrawal and disconnection. Men with depression often describe a sense of disconnection from their relationships, from the activities that they used to enjoy, or from any felt sense of engagement with their own lives. Somehow they're present, but they're also not there. They're going through the motions. They're kind of watching themselves from a slight distance. It tends to manifest itself as withdrawal from social contact, turning down invitations, becoming that bit harder to reach, maybe being physically in the room while their heads are somewhere else completely. And it can be mistaken, both by the man himself and by those around him. Sometimes people think they're just dealing with someone who's introverted, or tired, or simply got things on their mind. Now, it's worth distinguishing from those things by its persistence, its departure from previous patterns, and its resistance to things that usually restore a man's energy and his engagement. Now, the third, and perhaps a particularly important one, are the physical symptoms. Men with depression are significantly more likely than women to present with physical symptoms as their primary complaint. Persistent fatigue that doesn't resolve, unexplained aches and pains, digestive problems, headaches, a general physical flatness. Depression produces measurable physiological changes, such as elevated inflammatory markers, disrupted cortisol patterns, altered pain perception thresholds, all of which generate genuine physical experience. The man whose depression manifests primarily as physical symptoms isn't imagining it. He's experiencing the physical reality of a psychological condition. And in most clinical consultations, it's the physical symptoms that are mainly investigated. The psychological dimension often doesn't even get asked about. Now, the fourth is exhaustion and loss of drive. Things that used to engage him just don't anymore. Goals that once mattered don't matter either. This is often experienced and described as a lack of motivation or even a lack of willpower, particularly by men who've spent their lives defining themselves through productivity and drive. But it isn't either of those things. It's one of the most consistent features of depression, and its misinterpretation as a character failing rather than a symptom prevents a great deal of help seeking. The fifth I want to mention is escapism and avoidance. Men with depression often describe an intensified drive towards escape from the internal experience of depression and from the external circumstances that they come to associate with it. So, throwing themselves into excessive work or physical activity, gambling, risk-taking, gaming, an absorption in something that has driven compulsive quality rather than the quality of some kind of genuine enjoyment. Now, none of these activities of themselves is inherently problematic. The signal is in the function, whether the activity is being used to engage with life or just to escape from it. Men are much more likely than women to use alcohol as a response to psychological distress, and the relationship between alcohol and depression is both strong and bidirectional. The irony, and it's a significant irony, is that the self-reliance that feels like strength is, in this context at least, making the situation worse. The third reason is that they don't know what help looks like. Many men have no framework for talking to someone about psychological difficulties. They've got no model for therapy, no experience with it, and no sense of what it might offer. So these are all unknowns, and combined with the cultural messaging around help-seeking, they produce inertia. The fourth, probably the one I find most clinically significant, is the belief that somehow all this will pass. The push-through mentality that serves men, or appears to, in various other contexts, if it's applied to depression, well, there's considerably less success. If it's left unaddressed, depression doesn't reliably pass. It tends to persist, it tends to deepen, and it expands its footprint in a man's life until it becomes impossible to ignore. At which point, it's either more entrenched and harder to treat than it would have been earlier. Now I want to turn to this last section for partners, friends, colleagues and family members who might be listening to this because they're concerned about someone rather than themselves. Now, the signs to watch out for are all the behavioural ones I've described: increased irritability, withdrawal from their usual activities and relationships, increased drinking, physical complaints without an obvious cause, a quality of flatness or absence, perhaps even a dark humour that's acquired a frequency or an edge that feels different from before. The approach that seems to help is towards more direct, specific, and non-judgmental inquiry, followed by listening rather than the temptation to advise. So saying things like, "How are you?" is a bit different from saying something like, "You've seemed a bit off recently. How are things actually going?" The difference between the two is specificity. If you ask a general question, you're likely to get a general answer. An observation, however, that you've noticed something and that you're asking because you want to know, is a bit harder to deflect. If the first answer you get is something like, "I'm fine," and it's delivered without conviction, the most useful thing to say is some kind of version of, "Well, you really don't look fine. What's going on?" Now, the second, if gently but directly delivered, might produce a more honest response than the first. It's not an absolute, but at least it's an attempt. It signals in any case that you're not going to be fobbed off and that you're genuinely interested rather than performing some kind of concern because it's expected of you. Men who are depressed are very unlikely to identify themselves as depressed. They're unlikely to volunteer the fact that they're struggling, and they're unlikely to ask for help without some form of prompting. The person who notices and asks and keeps asking is frequently the reason a man eventually gives up and goes to get help. Now, it may sound frustrating, but it's no small thing. Depression, it's worth noting, exists on a spectrum, and at its serious end, it becomes a real medical emergency. So I'd suggest the following warrants urgent attention. If the person is expressing hopelessness about the future in ways that feel absolute rather than situational, by that I mean saying things like, "Life isn't worth living," a full withdrawal from social contact, maybe even giving away possessions, or a sudden and unexplained calm following a period of very evident distress, and that can indicate that some kind of decision has been made and not to the benefit of the person. If you recognize any of this, not necessarily all of it, but enough, the next step is a conversation with your doctor. Be as direct as you can about what you've been experiencing, including the symptoms that may not fit the standard picture of what you believe depression is. If the physical symptoms have been the presenting complaint in a previous visit, say explicitly that you're wondering whether there might be a psychological dimension. Give the doctor some clues to hang on to. Depression isn't a character flaw. It's not a weakness, And it's not the consequence of insufficient toughness or some kind of inadequate grip on yourself. It's a condition with identifiable neurological, physiological, and psychological mechanisms. It's got a known profile of symptoms, and there are a range of effective treatments that work considerably better when applied before the condition has been running unchecked for some months or even years. The men who seek help for depression are not the ones who can't handle it. They're the ones who understood that handling it meant getting some appropriate support rather than quietly deteriorating and maintaining the appearance of being fine. That distinction is, for some men, the most important one they'll ever make. If this episode's raised anything personal for you, please don't sit with it alone. You'll find the full written article on my website, drjerrykennard.com. Everything's there is free to read, and the resources page lists further support for both the UK and the US.